This is Ivy City, a small neighborhood off New York Avenue Northeast that is many things: a longtime dumping ground for the district, an even longer home to a tight-knit African American community, a food and liquor store manufacturing hotspot, an up-and-coming neighborhood, according to some, and a place that others say have been forgotten, abandoned, and neglected for decades. I want to share with you some reviews on Ivy City from people who live there or was just passing through. I also want to highlight a news article from the Washington Post about 6 years ago discussing the new changes in Ivy City. The Washington Post article was written by Maura Judkis and published in November 2015. The article is called "The Next Cool DC Neighborhood You Have Never Heard of." And the article begins by saying, when developer Doug Jamal stands on the front steps of his new apartment development in the former Heck warehouse in Northeast Washington, gazing out at the panorama before him, he's like a monarch surveying his kingdom. Almost everything, as far as the eye can see, belongs to him. The Washington Post article also states that Ivy City got its name from Thomas Seton Donahoe, a Civil War era poet and author who was obsessed with ivy. He called his three-story house Ivy Hall. He titled his book of poetry Ivy Wall, and he dubbed his estate Ivy City, and the name stuck and became official in 1873. Here's a map of Ivy City with recent changes. I marked a big red X to show you where the government facility was across the street on West Virginia Avenue, and Mount Olivet Cemetery lie right behind that. I drew a red arrow to show that if you continued up this way, New York Avenue, this is the direction you're headed into Maryland. Now on the opposite side of the neighborhood, I drew a big red X to show where Gallaudet University sits in the next neighborhood of Trinidad. The red arrow shows which direction is headed to downtown DC, where the White House is. The purple building shows the newly developed Hecht apartment building. The pink buildings show restaurants, and the blue buildings are distilleries. And right on the front of the neighborhood on New York Avenue is a homeless shelter. I highlighted in yellow to show where 75% of the residents of Ivy City live. With this in mind, I'll read some of the reviews of this neighborhood, good and bad. A 5-star review of a current resident said, "This is a very fun place to live if you take advantage of all the local businesses and build relationships with neighbors. However, crime is a real problem and you must be willing to expect the unexpected. Unfortunately, there's a shelter here which is completely mismanaged and overflowing with mental illness and dysfunction. The police department are excellent and respond quickly but receive poor support from the city council. Instead of increasing their budget to help fight crime, they reduce it and don't care about the consequences. If you love good food, this is the home of the world-famous Ivy City Smokehouse, as well as other restaurants and many local distilleries and breweries." A 4-star review by a current resident says, "Ivy City is not that big of a neighborhood, but overall, I have had a very pleasant experience living here. The apartment I live in, the Hecht, is a bit far from the nearest metro station, but we have a shuttle service running during the weekdays. We are very close to the grocery store, and I always feel very safe, since there are police officers around almost all the time. The homeless people can make walking around very uncomfortable, but otherwise, everything here is pretty much fine." Then the 3-star review says, "In this area they should remodel the apartment complex to make it look more comfortable on the outside." The one-star review by a nearby resident said, "A man followed me wherever I went and tried to get into my car at the end of the night. Overall, this was a terrible place to visit." Here's an article from Neighborhood Scout that considers Ivy City's real estate notable and unique. A section of this article says, "This neighborhood is an absolutely outstanding example of the dominance of small 2, 3, and 4 unit apartment buildings compared to neighborhoods across the nation. In addition, the Ivy City neighborhood is very unique in that it has one of the highest proportions of 1, 2, or no bedroom real estate in any neighborhood in America." A critic of the Washington Post article called Trinity Prez says, "The next cool DC neighborhood you have never heard of." Really, Washington Post? Who has not heard of Ivy City? The people who live there know it. The people who live nearby in Trinidad and Eckington and Edgewood and Brooklyn and other wonderful Northeast neighborhoods know it. Is the Washington Post news only for people west of North Capitol Street, for whom Northeast seems like the great uncharted continent? The headline is fairly typical of this newspaper's terrible habit of stereotyping neighborhoods according to the biases of elites who view neighborhoods not their own as somehow exotic, foreign, or only recently discovered, like Columbus' voyage to the ancient New World. And by the way, your participle is dangling. Here's a comment left by Pat Bond giving insight on the developer Doug Jamal by saying, "Doug Jamal has a long history of taking blighted property, investing into them, and building the neighborhood up. The people owe him a large debt for his dedication to saving some brilliant architecture. With his skill set, he could have been off in Tyson's or Roslyn building forgettable cubes. Much as I liked when I lived in Arlington, how many new structures built since 1975 will be memorable in 2040? And then the Washington Post introduces us to Parisa Nurauzi, the executive director of the community organizing group called Empower DC. Her organization helped neighbors sue the district in 2012 to block a proposed bus depot. Here's a neighborhood that within the span of a couple of years is still undesirable enough to put a bus depot, but is also the next place where the city would never dare put a bus depot, says Nurauzi. It's been teetering on the edge of blight and gentrification, and neither one of those are fair to these multi-generational families who have sustained Ivy City. What Nurauzi sees happening in Ivy City is the familiar gentrification story. The lucky few who own their homes may be able to stay, if they can deal with the inevitable tax increases. The renters, she fears, are likely to be displaced. But for now, one of the only places drawing activity is the Planet Fitness in the building, where huge lettering on the stairs tell patrons, "You belong." Do they? The question of belonging elicits mixed feelings from the neighborhood's activists and longtime residents, who are eager to take advantage of the new amenities but wary of being gentrified out of their homes. Thank you for bearing with me through these articles and reviews, but what do you think? How would you rate Ivy City? And I appreciate you for hanging out with me. I'm Dickie D in DC, and I will see you in the next video.